The silence of the hospital waiting room was broken only by the distant hum of air conditioners and the occasional scuff of slippers on the cold tile floor. It was a rainy winter Monday, and the gray light filtering through the fogged windows cast a melancholic, almost ghostly atmosphere over the room. Among the faded blue plastic chairs, people waited in varying states of anxiety and resignation, some flipping through old magazines with yellowed covers, others staring blankly into space, lost in thoughts known only to themselves. Then she entered. Margaret walked slowly, leaning on a dark wooden cane that had belonged to her husband. Her steps were measured, deliberate, each movement calculated to avoid awakening the pain that had plagued her knees for years. She wore a simple brown coat, impeccably clean, and carried a worn leather handbag clutched to her chest as if it held treasures. Her gray hair was pulled back in a low bun, revealing a face that, despite the deep wrinkles around her eyes, maintained an almost majestic serenity. There was something about her posture, a quiet dignity, a calmness that seemed impervious to life's storms, that caused people to notice her even if only for a fleeting moment. She approached the reception desk with the same unhurried cadence, waiting patiently while the receptionist, a young woman with haphazardly styled blonde hair and nails decorated with colorful stickers, chatted on the phone about her weekend plans. Margaret waited and waited. Her fingers, marked by prominent veins and age spots, tapped lightly on the counter's surface, an almost imperceptible gesture of nervousness that she quickly controlled. "Excuse me," she said finally, her voice low but firm. The young woman held up an index finger, signaling her to wait, without even glancing up from her phone. She continued her conversation for another 5 minutes, laughing at something someone said on the other end of the line, while Margaret remained there, motionless, her hands clasped around her cane, her eyes fixed on an undefined point in front of her. In the nearby chairs, other people began to notice. A middle-aged man in a rumpled suit lowered his newspaper and watched the scene with a growing expression of discomfort. A mother holding a baby frowned, but looked away when the child started to cry. A teenager with headphones paused his music and stared, his fingers fidgeting on his phone screen. When the receptionist finally hung up the phone, it was with an exaggerated sigh of annoyance, as if the interruption was a personal inconvenience. "Yes? Good morning. I have an appointment at 9 o'clock with Dr. Henry. My name is Margaret Smith." The young woman typed something into the computer with jerky movements, the clicks of the keyboard echoing like tiny hammers in the quiet room. "It's not here. Are you sure it's today?" Margaret carefully opened her purse and took out a crumpled piece of paper, a prescription slip where she had noted, in shaky but legible handwriting, all the details of the appointment. "Yes, I'm sure. Monday, 9 o'clock, Dr. Henry Cardoso." "Well, it's not in the system. You must be mistaken. The next available appointment is next month." There was something in the receptionist's voice, a barely concealed impatience, a tone that suggested that people like Margaret were a burden, an obstacle between her and the end of her shift. Margaret took a deep breath, her fingers closing around the paper as if it were an anchor. "Oh. May I show you? I have everything written down here. The doctor's secretary called me last week to confirm." "Ma'am, I already told you it's not in the system. There's nothing I can do." The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Margaret nodded slowly, folded the paper carefully, and put it back in her purse. There was no anger in her movements, no despair, only a deep resignation, as if such situations were just another chapter in a long story of small humiliations that she had learned to endure in silence. "Okay, thank you." She moved away from the counter and walked to one of the farthest chairs, in a row near the wall where a faded painting of a pastoral landscape hung. She sat down carefully, placed her cane beside the chair, and closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength for what was to come. Then he appeared. Dr. Samuel was a man in his 60s, with graying hair and gold-rimmed glasses that reflected the fluorescent light from the ceiling. He wore an impeccable white lab coat, but what was most striking about his figure wasn't his medical appearance. It was something indefinable in his presence, a quiet authority that seemed to emanate not from titles or positions, but from a wisdom gained through decades of caring for people. He had walked the halls of that hospital for over 30 years, and in that time he had learned to read not only symptoms and diagnoses, but also the subtext of human suffering. He stopped in front of the counter, greeted the receptionist with a courteous nod, and turned to observe the waiting room. It was then that his eyes met Margaret's, sitting alone, her hands clasped in her lap, staring into space with an expression he recognized immediately, the silent face of wounded dignity. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the receptionist, "but wasn't that woman over there waiting to be seen?" "Oh, her? She got the day of her appointment wrong. Nothing was scheduled." Dr. Samuel frowned. There was something about the young woman's nonchalant tone that deeply disturbed him. He approached Margaret, his step soft on the cold floor. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm Dr. Samuel. May I ask the reason for your visit today?" Margaret looked up, surprised by the unexpected kindness. For a moment she seemed to hesitate, as if she wasn't used to receiving respectful attention in an environment like this. "I have an appointment with Dr. Henry, but it seems there's been a mistake." "It's okay, I can come back another day. May I see your appointment slip?" With careful fingers, Margaret retrieved the crumpled paper from her purse and handed it to the doctor. Dr. Samuel examined it closely, noticing not only the neat handwriting, but also the worn creases, as if the paper had been handled countless times in the past few days. And it was at this moment that something extraordinary happened, something that would forever change the atmosphere of that place, and touch the hearts of everyone present in a way they would never forget. Allow me to pause here, because there's something important I need to share with you who are following this story. If you're feeling what I'm feeling as I tell this account, this mix of indignation and hope, this deep-seated need to see justice and goodness prevail, then you understand why stories like this need to be told and retold. That's why this channel exists, to celebrate the quiet acts of heroism that happen every day around us, but are rarely noticed or celebrated. If you want to continue receiving narratives that restore your faith in humanity, that remind you that there are good people doing the right thing, even when no one is looking, then subscribe to the channel now and hit the notification bell. Because when you subscribe, you're not just following a channel, you're joining a community of people who believe that small acts of kindness can change the world. And trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next in this story, nor the next ones we have to tell. Now, let's get back to finding out what Dr. Samuel will do with this situation. Dr. Samuel examined the paper for a few more seconds, then walked back to the counter. His posture had subtly changed. There was now a firmness in his movements that wasn't there before. "I need to check something in the system," he said to the receptionist. "Doctor, I already explained to the lady that she doesn't have anything scheduled. Please let me check." He positioned himself behind the computer and began typing. His fingers moved with the same precision with which he examined patients, each keystroke purposeful. The receptionist stood beside him, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, while other people in the waiting room began to pay attention to what was happening. "Here it is," said Dr. Samuel, after a few minutes. "Monday, 9 a.m. Margaret Smith. Appointment with Dr. Henry Cardoso. It's been registered since last week." The silence that followed was palpable. The receptionist opened and closed her mouth several times, like a fish out of water, while a wave of embarrassment washed over her face. "I didn't see it. It must have been a system error." Dr. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes, no accusation, only a deep sadness and a disappointment that seemed to come from a very old place in his soul. "The system doesn't fail on its own," he said, his voice low but clearly audible to everyone in the room. "Sometimes we fail." He turned and walked to where Margaret was sitting. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Mrs. Smith," he said, stopping in front of her and bowing slightly in a respectful bow that shocked everyone present. "On behalf of the entire staff of this hospital, I apologize for the treatment you received today. This does not represent who we are or the values we work by. Margaret blinked several times, as if unable to process what was happening. You don't need to apologize, doctor. These things happen. No, ma'am. These things shouldn't happen, especially not to someone who clearly prepared so carefully to be here today. He gently pointed to the cane beside the chair, to the impeccably clean coat, to the organized purse, details that revealed how much that appointment meant to her, how much effort she had put into that moment. May I ask how many times you've come to the hospital in the past few months? This would be the third time. The other two also had small problems. The answer fell into the room like a stone in a quiet lake, creating waves of understanding and shame that spread to everyone present. The man in the rumpled suit completely folded his newspaper and watched. The mother with the baby leaned forward in her chair. The teenager completely removed his headphones. Dr. Samuel took a deep breath. When he spoke again, his voice echoed throughout the room, clear and firm. Mrs. Smith, from today on, I want you to know that you have an ally in this hospital. My name is on my ID here, Dr. Samuel Ribeiro. If you have any problem, any difficulty, I want you to come to me directly. My office is on the 3rd floor, room 312. If I'm not there, leave a message with my secretary, and she will treat you with the respect and dignity you deserve. He turned to the waiting room, now addressing everyone present. There's something I've learned in 30 years of medicine. When we treat someone with disrespect, we're not just hurting one person, we're hurting ourselves, because each of us, one day, will be sitting in one of these chairs. Each of us, one day, will be the vulnerable person who needs help, and at that moment, we'll hope that someone treats us with the same kindness we would have liked to have offered others. He paused, his eyes scanning each face in the room. I don't need to know Margaret's life story to know she's someone special. I can see it in the way she cares for her belongings, in the patience with which she waited, in the dignity with which she faced an unpleasant situation. I imagine she's a mother, perhaps a grandmother. I imagine she's worked hard, cared for others, and done her part to make this world a little better. Margaret began to cry. These weren't tears of sadness, but something far more complex, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and surprise at being seen, truly seen, by someone who cared. And even if I were wrong about all of that, Dr. Samuel continued, even if I knew nothing about her life, she would still deserve to be treated with respect simply for being human. He turned again to the receptionist, who was now bright red, tears streaming down her face. Carla, he said, using the name on her ID badge. I know you're a good person. I've seen you help other patients. I've seen you work diligently. We all have bad days. We all make mistakes. But when we err, we have the opportunity to do better next time. Carla nodded vigorously, unable to speak. Mrs. Smith, Dr. Samuel said, turning back to her. Dr. Henry is a little late today, but he'll be here in 15 minutes. May I ask someone to bring you a coffee while you wait? And if you'll allow me, I'd like to escort you to his office when he arrives, just to make sure everything goes smoothly. Margaret finally managed to speak, her voice choked with emotion. Thank you, doctor, but you didn't need to do all this for me. Miss Smith, he said, smiling for the first time since he'd arrived, it was a privilege to do this for you, and more than that, it was a privilege for all of us to learn from your dignity today. Something extraordinary happened then. One by one, the people in the waiting room began to rise. The man in the rumpled suit was the first, walking over to Margaret and simply saying, "It was an honor to meet you, ma'am." The mother with the baby approached and said, "I hope your appointment goes well." The teenager, usually lost in his digital world, put away his phone and said, "You're amazing." Carla came from behind the counter, approached Margaret with hesitant steps, and knelt beside her chair. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words coming out in gasps between tears. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. You didn't deserve that. Margaret reached out and gently touched the young woman's face. It's all right, dear. Everyone has difficult days. No, Carla said, shaking her head. It's not all right, but I'll do better. I promise I'll do better. When Dr. Henry finally arrived, he found a completely transformed waiting room. People were conversing in low, respectful tones. Carla was attending to each patient as if they were the most important person in the world, and Margaret, sitting in the same chair where she had been ignored an hour before, was now the silent center of a network of care and respect that had spontaneously formed around her. Dr. Samuel escorted Margaret to the doctor's office as he had promised. As they stepped out of the elevator on the third floor, she stopped and turned to him. Doctor, may I ask something? Of course, ma'am. Why did you do that for me? You don't even know me. Dr. Samuel was silent for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. Years ago, my mother was ill. She was a woman much like you. Dignified, patient, always trying not to bother anyone. One day, she went to a hospital for an important appointment, and there, she was treated exactly as you were treated today. She came home crying, feeling small and invisible. He paused, his eyes distant for a moment. I promised myself that day, that whenever I could, I would do differently, that I would never let anyone feel the way my mother felt that day. And your mother, doctor? Your mother, doctor? How is she? She passed away the following year, but I know she would be proud to know that her pain served to ensure others were treated with more dignity. Margaret nodded, deeply understanding what had happened. So in a way, your mother was also present downstairs today. Yes, said Dr. Samuel, smiling. I think she was. Margaret's appointment went perfectly. Dr. Henry, who had been informed about the incident, treated her with special care, taking extra time to explain every detail of her treatment. When she left the office an hour later, she carried not only the prescriptions she needed, but also something far more precious, the memory that there were still good people in the world. People willing to defend the defenseless and to transform moments of pain into lessons in humanity. Carla waited for her at the reception desk with a genuine smile and a piece of paper in her hand. Mrs. Smith, I've scheduled your next appointment and written down my direct number here. If you have any problems, any questions, call me, and I promise we'll treat you as you deserve to be treated. In the days that followed, the story spread throughout the hospital, not as gossip or drama, but as a silent lesson on the power of doing what's right. Carla completely changed her way of working, becoming known for the kindness with which she treated all patients. Other staff members, inspired by Dr. Samuel's example, began to pay more attention to the people they served, especially those who seemed more vulnerable or forgotten. Dr. Samuel never spoke about the incident to anyone. He didn't seek recognition or applause. For him, it had simply been what any decent person would do in the same situation, but his action had a cascading effect that spread far beyond the walls of that hospital. The man in the rumpled suit, whose name was Robert, went home that night and told his wife about what he had witnessed. He had spent years complaining about the lack of manners in people, the rudeness of the modern world, but had never done anything to change it. Inspired by what he saw, he started paying more attention to the people around him, the building superintendent, the bakery owner, the newspaper boy. Small gestures, small kindnesses that began to transform his daily interactions. The mother with the baby, Anna, was a nurse at another hospital. She returned to work the next day with a completely new perspective on how she treated the most difficult patients, the most demanding ones, those who arrived scared and behaved badly because of anxiety. She began to see beyond the superficial behavior, looking for the person behind the pain. The teenager, Matthew, couldn't stop thinking about the silent strength he had witnessed in Margaret. That same week, he saw a classmate being humiliated by a group of bullies at school. For the first time in his life, instead of pretending not to see or walking away, he stood up for the boy, not with violence, but with the same quiet firmness he had witnessed that morning at the hospital. The ripples spread, touching lives in ways that would never be fully known or measured. 3 months later, Margaret returned to the hospital for a follow-up appointment. When she arrived at the reception desk, Carla recognized her immediately and stood up to greet her with a radiant smile. "Mrs. Smith, how are you? How are you feeling?" "Very well, dear. And you?" "Great. I've learned a lot since our last meeting." While waiting in the waiting room, in the same chair where she had been ignored months before, Margaret observed the movement around her. There was something different in the air, something she couldn't quite define. People seemed kinder to each other. The staff smiled more. There was an atmosphere of mutual respect that wasn't there on her first visit. Dr. Samuel appeared a few minutes later, as he had promised he would on all her visits. "Mrs. Smith, how are you feeling?" "Much better, doctor. And I want to thank you again for what you did." "You don't need to thank me, ma'am. Actually, I'm the one who should be thanking you." "What do you mean?" "You reminded me of something I had forgotten. You reminded me of why I became a doctor. It wasn't just to cure diseases, but to care for people, to see the person behind the symptom, the story behind the pain." He paused, observing the waiting room. "You don't know this, but your presence here, your dignity that day, changed this place. It changed people, and I'm sure it continues to change people wherever you go." Margaret smiled, a serene expression that radiated wisdom accumulated over decades of life. "Doctor, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course. It wasn't the first time I was treated like that, and it probably won't be the last. But I've learned, over the years, that how we react to those moments defines who we are. I can let them make me feel small, or I can remember that my worth doesn't depend on how others see me." She adjusted her cane beside the chair. "And sometimes, when we maintain our dignity in the most difficult moments, we inspire other people to be better. Not because we plan it, but because kindness is contagious, just like cruelty." Dr. Samuel nodded, deeply understanding her words. "You're a teacher, Margaret, maybe the best I've ever known." "We're all teachers, doctor. We're all students. The question is, what lesson do we choose to teach each day?" When Margaret left the hospital that afternoon, she walked slowly down the sidewalk, leaning on the cane that had belonged to her husband. The sun was setting, painting the sky with golden hues that reflected in the windows of the surrounding buildings. She stopped at a bus stop and sat on the cold metal bench, waiting for the bus that would take her home. Next to her, a young woman sat down, looking exhausted, probably returning from work. The girl sighed heavily, letting out the weariness of a difficult day. Margaret observed her discreetly, and after a few minutes, said softly, "Tough day, dear." The young woman turned, initially surprised to be approached by a stranger. But there was something in Margaret's voice, a genuine kindness, that made her lower her defenses. "Very tough. I work in an office where it seems like nobody cares about anybody. Sometimes, I wonder if it's worth it to keep trying to be a good person in a world that doesn't value that." Margaret smiled. "It is, dear. It always is. Sometimes we don't see the results immediately, but kindness always makes a difference. Always." The bus arrived, and they both got on. During the ride, Margaret told the young woman about a book she had recently read, about a garden a woman planted in an abandoned square. At first, people trampled the flowers and threw trash on top, but the woman kept planting, watering, caring. Gradually, some people began to notice, then they started to help, and eventually, the entire square transformed into a community garden where children played and families had picnics. The secret, Margaret said, wasn't the gardening, it was the persistence. It was continuing to do what was right, even when it seemed like nobody was paying attention. The young woman got off the bus 3 stops later, but not before shaking Margaret's hand and saying, "Thank you, I needed to hear that today." Margaret waved from the window as the bus pulled away, and smiled to herself. She didn't know the girl's name, she probably would never see her again, but she was sure that that brief conversation would plant a seed, and seeds, she knew from experience, have the power to grow in the most unexpected places. She arrived home as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Her home was simple, a small apartment in an old building, with worn but well cared for furniture, and family photographs scattered across the walls. She made some tea, settled into her favorite armchair by the window, and reflected on the day. She thought of Dr. Samuel and the courage he had shown in taking a stand. She thought of Carla and the transformation she had witnessed in the young woman's face. She thought of all the people in the waiting room, who for a moment had connected through a shared sense of humanity. But more than anything, she thought about the responsibility we all bear for one another, the opportunity we have, each day, to choose between indifference and compassion, between cynicism and hope. She opened an old notebook she kept on the table beside her armchair, and wrote, in the same careful script she had displayed at the hospital, "Today I learned once again that we are not defined by the bad things that happen to us, but by how we respond to them, and that an act of kindness, however small it may seem, can change the course of many lives. Sometimes we are someone's Dr. Samuel, sometimes we are the Margaret, sometimes we are the Carla, learning to be better, but always, always, we have the choice of what role we want to play in the lives of others." She closed the notebook and looked out the window, watching the city lights twinkling in the distance like earthly stars. Each light represented a life, a story, a person fighting their own battles, carrying their own burdens, seeking their own form of dignity in the world. And that night, as the city slept, the ripples continued to spread. Carla went home and treated her younger brother with more patience. Robert helped an elderly woman carry her groceries to her car. Anna held the hand of a frightened patient during a procedure. Matthew defended a classmate at school. Small gestures, almost imperceptible moments, but each one carried a bit of the quiet dignity they had witnessed that morning at the hospital. Each one was a seed planted in the communal garden of humanity, and somewhere, in another hospital, in another waiting room, a tired and forgotten person would sit in a faded blue plastic chair, waiting for help, and perhaps, if they were lucky, they would find their own Dr. Samuel, or perhaps, they would discover they had the strength to be their own Margaret, because this is the deepest truth about kindness. It is not a limited resource that